In the golden age of sail, long before the advent of fossil fuels, the wheels of human civilization were greased by animal fat. Today, the 19th century whaling industry is often viewed through a warm, romanticized lens. Popular culture presents an image of rugged, stoic mariners matching wits with Leviathan under a sky of pristine canvas, wrestling the ferocious elements and returning home to cobblestone docks as wealthy heroes. It is a comforting myth, carefully polished by time, nostalgia, and fiction. The unvarnished reality, preserved in the faded ink of logbooks and the grim statistics of maritime courts, was an industrialized nightmare. During the mid-1800s, America ran on whale oil. The premier catch, the sperm whale, carried a highly prized substance in its massive forehead called spermaceti, a wax-like oil that burned with a brilliant, odorless, smoke-free flame. It lit the street lamps of New York, Philadelphia, and London. It illuminated the grand parlors of the wealthy and fed the lighthouses that kept global trade routes safe. Furthermore, the thick, heavy oil harvested from the right whale's blubber lubricated the roaring spinning jennies of textile mills and the heavy iron gears of the early steam locomotives. The elite shipowners who financed these voyages became some of the wealthiest individuals per capita in the United States, building sprawling, neoclassical stone mansions that still stand today in New Bedford, Massachusetts. But that immense wealth was paid for with a currency of pure human suffering. The men who actually went down into the deep water did not get rich. They were disposable fuel for a predatory economic engine that systematically ground them to dust. To sign a whaling contract, known as the ship's articles, was to legally surrender your body, your labor, your health, and your fundamental human rights to a floating, isolated prison for up to 5 years of your life. The horror of the whale ship did not begin when a man first stepped onto the deck, nor did it start when he first smelled the salty tang of the open Atlantic. It began long before, in the dark, smoky boarding houses, low-end taverns, and crowded recruitment offices lining the waterfronts of bustling ports. By the 1840 and 1850, the maritime world was well aware of the true nature of whaling. Experienced merchant seamen, who enjoyed fixed monthly wages and predictable routes, knew better than to ever sign onto a whaler. They looked down on whalemen with a mixture of pity and deep disgust, viewing them as the lowest caste of the seafaring world, because the reputation of these ships was so notoriously awful. Shipowners faced a permanent, desperate shortage of manual labor. To fill the forecastles of their departing vessels, they relied on a highly organized, predatory network of recruiters known in the waterfront vernacular as crimps or shipping sharks. These agents were human traffickers in all but name. They operated on a bounty system, receiving a fixed cash payment from the shipowners for every warm body they could successfully coerce or trick into signing a contract. To maximize their profits, the shipping sharks targeted the most vulnerable, desperate, and naive segments of the population. They swept through inland farming communities across New England, New York, and Ohio, finding young farm boys who had never seen a body of water larger than a cow pond. The agents painted dazzling pictures of global travel, exotic tropical islands, and a glorious fortune waiting to be skimmed from the top of the sea. They patrolled the immigration docks of Boston and New York, swooping down on fresh arrivals from Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia, men who were completely destitute, spoke no English, and could not comprehend the legal jargon written on the documents pushed under their noses. The crimps also frequented the seediest parts of the city, targeting men fleeing abusive marriages, criminals on the run from the law, and alcoholics drowning in insurmountable debt. The primary tool used to ensnare these unsuspecting greenhands was a unique financial mechanism known as the lay. Unlike a traditional factory on land or a standard merchant vessel at sea, a whaling ship paid absolutely no fixed monthly or weekly wage. Instead, the legal structure of the voyage dictated that every single member of the crew, from the aristocratic captain down to the illiterate 15-year-old greenhand, was an independent stakeholder in the venture. Every man was assigned a specific fraction of the voyage's ultimate net profits, called his lay. To an idealistic, uneducated teenager, this arrangement sounded like the ultimate meritocracy. The shipping agent would pour him a cheap glass of rum, slap him on the back, and explain that if the crew worked hard and filled the ship's hold with oil, he would return home a wealthy man with a pocket full of gold coins. A standard lay for a complete novice, a greenhand, was typically scaled anywhere between a 1/175th and a 1/250th share of the cargo. To a boy who had never earned more than a few pennies a day pulling weeds on a farm, a 1/200th share of a grand maritime expedition sounded like a fortune. What the agent intentionally and maliciously omitted from this pitch was the cold, hard mathematics of the industry. If a whale ship had a spectacularly successful voyage over 4 years, bringing home a massive cargo of oil valued at $50,000, a 1/200th lay amounted to a gross share of just $250. When divided across 48 months of relentless, life-threatening labor, the sailor's earnings amounted to pennies a day. But the economic trap ran far deeper than a deceptively small percentage. The entire financial architecture of the whaling voyage was structurally designed to ensure that the average sailor remained in a permanent state of debt. The very moment a recruit put his mark or signature on the ship's articles, he entered a financial labyrinth from which there was no legal escape. The shipping agent did not provide transit to the whaling port out of the goodness of his heart. The price of the train or steamboat ticket to New Bedford was immediately charged to the recruit's future unearned share. The cost of the squalid room and board at the agent's designated boarding house while waiting for the ship to fit out, charged. The cheap, poorly constructed canvas suit of clothes placed on his back, charged. By the time the green hand walked up the gangplank and stepped onto the wooden deck of his assigned ship, he was already deeply in the negative. Before he had handled a single line or seen a single wave, he owed the ship's owners a debt that would take months, sometimes a year, of hard labor just to erase. Once the ship broke away from the dock, the sailor was introduced to his absolute master, the captain, and with the captain came the ultimate instrument of financial coercion on the high seas, the ship's store, universally known as the slop chest. A mid-19th century whale ship was a completely isolated city, cruising the open ocean for 3 to 5 years at a time without ever touching a civilized port. The natural elements were brutal on clothing. Within a matter of weeks, a sailor's heavy leather boots would rot through from constant exposure to corrosive salt water. His trousers would tear open during a frantic climb up the rigging in a gale. In the freezing waters of the Arctic or the Antarctic, a man without a thick wool coat or a heavy blanket would face literal death from hypothermia. Because the sailor had no access to a market, he had only one source for replacements: the captain's slop chest. The slop chest was a legal monopoly of the most abusive order. Captains and shipowners bought cheap, low-quality, mass-produced clothes, shoes, blankets, and tobacco on land for pennies, and then stored them in the ship's hold. When a desperate, freezing sailor needed a new shirt or a plug of tobacco to numb the crushing boredom of his watch, the captain would open the chest and sell the items at an astronomical markup, sometimes inflated by 200% to 300% above retail value. The sailor did not pay cash. Instead, the captain would log the inflated price into the ship's ledger, adding it directly to the man's growing mountain of debt. If a sailor fell ill from a tropical fever or was injured by a snapping line and could not perform his duties, the captain could legally charge him for his daily food and the medicine administered from the ship's chest. If the voyage was going poorly and few whales were caught, the interest on these debts continued to accumulate. The entire system functioned as a form of maritime indentured servitude. As the heavy hemp mooring lines were cast off from the New Bedford docks and the massive canvas sails caught the coastal wind, the grim reality of the contract began to dawn on the green hands. They stood on the greasy, unfamiliar deck, watching the shoreline of Massachusetts slowly dissolve into a gray haze on the horizon. They realized, with a sudden sinking feeling in their chests, that the land they were leaving behind would not be walked upon again for half a decade. There were no weekends in their future. There were no holidays. There was no labor union, no regulatory agency, and absolutely no turning back. The legal trap had sprung, the harbor was gone, and the heavy wooden gate of the floating cage had just slammed shut. Once the last vestige of the American coastline dipped beneath the horizon, the romantic watercolor illusions shattered completely. The green hands, still nursing their seasickness, were abruptly introduced to the physical geography of their new world. They quickly discovered that a whale ship was not a majestic vessel of maritime discovery, but a floating, grease-slicked factory combined with a maximum security wooden prison. To truly understand the devastating psychological and physical toll of a whaler's life, one must abandon the open air of the deck, turn away from the ocean breeze, and descend deep into the bowels of the ship, where the crew was forced to exist during their few precious hours of rest. This squalid subterranean cavern was the forecastle, or forecastle, located in the absolute bow of the ship, directly beneath the waterline. Architecturally, the forecastle was a design of pure cruelty. It was a triangular, low-ceilinged vault carved out of the sharpest point of the ship's nose, an area explicitly chosen because it was entirely useless for storing valuable barrels of whale oil. To access it, a grown man had to squeeze his body through a tiny vertical hatchway on the main deck and climb down a steep, slippery ladder into pitch darkness. The space was minuscule. Imagine a room no larger than a modern walk-in closet or a small garden shed. Now, pack that room with 15 to 20 grown men who had not washed their bodies, changed their clothes, or seen a bar of soap in months. Because the forecastle was situated at the very front of the vessel, it absorbed the raw, violent impact of every single wave the ship encountered. While the officers slept near the stern, where the ship's motion was relatively stable, the common sailors in the bow were subjected to a permanent, sickening roller coaster ride. The bow pitched violently up and down, slamming into heavy ocean swells with a force that rattled a man's teeth and threw him from his berth. There were no windows, no portholes, and no structural avenues for fresh air to circulate. The solitary hatchway was the room's single lung. During heavy weather or winter storms, the officers on deck would batten this hatch down completely and secure it from the outside to prevent rogue waves from swamping the ship. When that hatch slammed shut, the forecastle instantly transformed into a suffocating, airtight tomb. The atmosphere within this sealed cavern quickly became a thick, toxic soup. A single, primitive lamp filled with foul, low-grade whale oil hung from a central beam, casting a dim, flickering yellow glow through the darkness. The lamp leaked heavy black soot that filled the room, coating the lungs of the sailors and leaving them coughing up dark phlegm. The air grew so starved of oxygen and choked with carbon dioxide that candles brought down from the deck would literally sputter and flicker out. The stench was an assault on the senses that many greenhands never grew accustomed to. It was a rancid mix of unwashed human flesh, the sharp tang of stale urine from the indoor night bucket, the fumes of cheap tobacco smoke, and the heavy, humid vapor of wet wool clothes that never truly dried. Beneath it all was the permanent, baseline scent of the whale ship, the sickening, sweet smell of rotting whale grease that had soaked deep into the grain of the oak timbers over decades of butchery. The beds where these men sought refuge were narrow, coffin-like wooden bunks stacked 3 high along the damp, weeping hull. These berths were stuffed with thin mattresses made of rotting corn husks or decaying straw. If a sailor was unfortunate enough to be assigned a bottom bunk, his sleep was systematically interrupted by the constant, salty drip of bilge water leaking through the deck seams directly onto his face. But the physical discomfort of the beds was nothing compared to the living entities that shared them. The forecastle was permanently gripped by 3 distinct, agonizing plagues. The first plague was the bedbugs. Hidden by the millions within the rotting straw mattresses, these insects emerged the moment the lamp was dimmed, feasting on the sleeping crew and leaving them covered from head to toe in angry, burning, intensely itchy welts. The second plague was the cockroaches. In the warm, humid climate of the tropics, the ship's hold became a massive incubator for roaches that grew up to 2 inches in length. They infested every crack and crevice of the forecastle, swarming over the sailors' faces, crawling into their open mouths as they slept, and eating the calloused skin around their fingernails. The final and most sinister plague was the rats. Hundreds of massive, aggressive ship rats scurried through the darkness, gnawing through leather sea chests, ruining clothing, eating into the men's meager food sacks, and occasionally biting the exposed, calloused toes of exhausted sailors who were too deep in a sleep of pure exhaustion to feel the pain. Yet, if the living quarters were a psychological meat grinder designed to erode a man's sanity, the ship's culinary provisions were an outright assault on human survival. On a voyage stretching across several years, fresh food was a luxury that vanished within the first fortnight of leaving New England. For the remaining 47 months of the journey, the crew's diet was a grim exercise in industrial chemical preservation. The absolute foundation of every single meal, served breakfast, lunch, and dinner, was hardtack, also known as sea biscuit. Hardtack was a simple primitive tile made of flour and water that had been baked up to 4 separate times until every single molecule of moisture was violently extracted. It was as hard as a kiln-fired brick. To eat it without instantly fracturing a molar, a sailor had to master the maritime ritual of preparing his bread. First, he would strike the hardtack sharply against the edge of the wooden mess table. This jarring impact was designed to dislodge the thousands of black-headed weevils and fat white maggots that nested deep inside the dry cracks. Sailors would routinely joke that the insects were the only source of fresh, untainted meat provided by the shipowners. If the biscuit was too hard to be broken by a knife, or if it was so heavily infested that it moved on its own, the men would submerge it in their tin cups of boiling, bitter black tea, waiting for the bugs to drown and float to the surface so they could skim them off before swallowing the remaining gray, gelatinous paste. Accompanying the hardtack was the dreaded salt junk. This was beef or pork that had been cut into chunks, packed tightly into heavy wooden barrels, and submerged in a highly concentrated, corrosive chemical brine. By the time a barrel was struck up from the dark hold and opened on deck, the meat had often been sitting in its own juices for 2, 3, or even 5 years. It was a sickly, iridescent shade of greenish-blue, covered in a slimy layer of yellow fat. The brine extracted all moisture and natural texture, turning the meat so structurally solid that sailors would regularly carve leftover chunks into functional shoe soles, pocket knife handles, or decorative buttons. To make this meat loose enough to be chewed, the ship's cook had to boil it for half a day in massive copper kettles filled with salt water pulled directly from the ocean. The resulting meal was a fibrous mass that tasted overwhelmingly of pure, stinging salt, a meal that satisfied hunger only to replace it with a violent, unquenchable thirst. But satisfying that thirst was perhaps the most dangerous endeavor of all. Fresh water on a 19th-century whaler was treated like liquid gold by the officers, yet it was treated like poison by the tongue. The water was stored in massive, unlined oak casks deep within the stagnant, unventilated hold. Within 3 to 4 weeks of departing port, the dead water would begin to ferment under the heat of the sun. Thick, stringy ropes of green slime and toxic algae grew rapidly along the interior walls of the casks. When a sailor pumped his daily, strictly measured ration into his wooden cup, the liquid was thick, ropey, and carried a pungent odor of sulfur, rot, and rust. It was common practice for men to close their eyes, hold their nostrils shut, and strain the fluid through their teeth to catch the largest chunks of slime before swallowing. Due to this absolute multi-year deprivation of fresh fruit, vegetables, or any viable source of vitamin C, the ancient, terrifying specter of scurvy held a permanent lease over the whaling fleet. Scurvy was not a sudden illness. It was a agonizing decomposition of the living body. It began with an overwhelming, bone-crushing fatigue that no amount of sleep could alleviate. A sailor's joints would begin to swell, turning a deep, bruised purple. Then the true horror manifested. The lack of vitamin C caused the body's cellular matrix to literally dissolve. A man's gums would turn black, soft, and spongy, growing over his teeth until they rotted at the root and dropped out into his food plate. Old wounds, cuts, and bone fractures that had healed decades prior would mysteriously tear themselves open and break apart again, as the body lost the ability to produce collagen. The men in the forecastle knew exactly what they needed to survive. They needed to touch land, eat green grass, and taste the juice of a fresh lime or orange. But on a whale ship, the captain's ledger and the pursuit of oil always took priority over the preservation of human flesh. The ship would continue to cruise, floating aimlessly through the empty blue of the open ocean, while the forgotten men of the forecastle rotted alive in their vermin-infested straw beds. If the physical degradation of the forecastle was a slow assault on a sailor's body, the daily routine above deck was a direct attack on his sanity. The grand, agonizing paradox of 19th-century whaling lay entirely in its pacing. A typical voyage lasted 4 or 5 grueling years. Yet the actual time spent chasing, capturing, and processing whales amounted to only a few weeks total. The vast majority of a whaleman's life, thousands upon thousands of empty, repeating hours, was defined by an oppressive, soul-crushing boredom. The ship would cruise the featureless, glass-like deserts of the Pacific, Atlantic, or Indian Oceans, tracing slow zigzags across the water in search of a tiny puff of vapor on the distant horizon. Weeks bled into months without a single sighting. Under the blistering heat of the equator, the sun became a weapon. It beat down on the wooden decks, melting the sticky black pitch right out of the planks and turning the living quarters below into an unbreathable oven. To prevent the crew from fracturing into mutiny out of sheer stagnation, the officers invented a never-ending cycle of meaningless, exhausting tasks. Men were ordered to scrape the heavy oak decks until the wood was raw. Polish brass fittings that were already brilliantly bright and dismantle and rebuild rigging that was perfectly functional. To preserve their remaining sanity, many sailors turned to the traditional art of scrimshaw. Using broken sail needles, old files, and pocket knives, men spent hundreds of silent hours intricately carving, scratching, and polishing the teeth and bones of past whale catches. They etched elaborate, beautiful drawings of ships, whales, and idealized portraits of sweethearts they hadn't seen in years, rubbing dark soot or tobacco juice into the grooved lines to make the artwork pop. These carvings were beautiful, but they were also tragic, literal monuments to thousands of wasted hours spent floating in a void. But on a whale ship, the boundary between absolute, mind-numbing numbness and lethal, adrenaline-fueled terror was a fraction of a second. The transition always exploded from the masthead. High above the deck, suspended in a tiny iron hoop called the crow's nest, a lookout stood for hours, scanning the endless blue. Suddenly, a high-pitched, desperate cry would shatter the silence, echoing across the water. "There she blows, clean bust! There she blows!" Instantly, the sleepy, stagnant world of the ship dissolved into a chaotic hive of frantic activity. Men dropped their scrimshaw tools, kicked aside their polishing rags, and sprinted blindly to their designated stations. The shift in energy was violent. Within 3 minutes, the fragile, 28-foot cedar whaleboats were swung out over the side and dropped into the unpredictable swells of the open ocean. 6 men rowed in each boat. They rowed in complete, breathless silence, pulling on heavy oar handles with all their might, approaching a 60-ton sperm whale from behind to avoid its highly sensitive hearing. The harpooner stood at the absolute bow. His knees locked into a wooden notch called the clumsy cleat. When the boat's nose practically touched the slick, black, wet skin of the beast, he lifted the heavy iron and drove it deep into the whale's flesh. The harpoon did not kill the whale, it was merely a tether. The moment the iron bit, the whale would panic and bolt, dragging the tiny wooden boat behind it at terrifying speeds of up to 20 knots. The sailors called this the Nantucket sleigh ride. The danger of this ride was absolute and immediate. The heavy hemp line attached to the harpoon whizzed out of its wooden tub so fast that the friction would catch the wooden logging post on fire if a sailor didn't constantly douse it with buckets of seawater. If a man accidentally stepped into a loop of that moving rope, or if a rogue coil caught his arm, he was instantly whipped overboard and dragged down into the dark abyss before he could even process what had happened. If the whale decided to dive straight down into the deep ocean, a maneuver called sounding, the bow of the boat would be dragged underwater in a matter of seconds, forcing an officer to frantically chop the line with a sharp axe, losing the prize and risking the lives of everyone on board. If the whale remained on the surface and finally exhausted itself, the true nightmare began. The crew had to haul themselves up the bloody rope, hand over hand, pulling their tiny boat directly into the thrashing, furious animal. The officer would then take a long, razor-sharp lance and repeatedly plunge it into the whale's side, searching for its lungs and vital organs. The whale would begin to spout thick, scalding fountains of hot, oily blood, covering the men and blinding them in a dense, crimson mist. In its final death throes, known as the gurry, the massive creature would blindly lash out in a frenzy of agony. 60 tons of muscle and bone would smash the water, easily flipping whaleboats upside down or shattering them into tiny matchsticks. Men were routinely crushed by the massive tail flukes, had their limbs broken by snapping lines, or were thrown helplessly into the water miles away from the mother ship. There, the immense scent of fresh blood immediately called up hundreds of sharks from the deep, turning the ocean into a boiling, churning red trap for any sailor left treading water. If a crew survived the initial violence of the hunt, their reward was not rest or a moment of celebration. Instead, the death of the whales signaled the beginning of days of unrelenting, back-breaking industrial butchery. The massive carcass, weighing tens of thousands of pounds, was towed through the water by the brute force of the oarsmen back to the mother ship. Once there, it was chained securely alongside the starboard hull. This moment marked the beginning of the cutting-in process, an assembly line conducted on the open ocean under the most hazardous conditions imaginable. To begin the harvest, the ship's mates stood suspended on flimsy, slippery wooden platforms called cutting stages, which hung directly over the raging sea. Armed with long-handled, razor-sharp blubber spades, the men sliced deep into the whale's neck and side. A massive iron hook attached to the ship's heavy windlass was lowered into the cut. As the crew on deck strained against the windlass bars, the ship rolled heavily in the ocean swells, peeling the thick layer of blubber off the whale's body in a continuous spiraling strip, much like peeling an apple. The entire main deck quickly transformed into a skating rink of gelatinous, highly dangerous oil, blood, and slime. One wrong footstep or a sudden lurch of the vessel meant sliding uncontrollably across the planks, either falling into the open hatchways or plunging over the side into the sea. Below the cutting stages, the water became a churning mass of hundreds of feeding sharks, drawn from miles away by the slick of blood, violently tearing at the whales, remains just inches from the sailors' feet. Once the massive, blanket pieces of blubber were hoisted onto the deck, they were sliced into smaller, manageable chunks called Bible leaves, thin slices that remained attached at the bottom to maximize the surface area exposed to heat. These pieces were then thrown directly into the tryworks, which were massive twin iron parts set into a heavy brick furnace built permanently right into the wooden deck of the ship. For 3 straight days and nights, the fires of the tryworks burned without a single moment of interruption. The whale ship ceased to be a sailing vessel and transformed into a floating oil refinery. The primary fuel used to keep the roaring furnaces hot enough to boil oil, the crispy, dried-out scraps of the whale's own fat, which had already been boiled down. The smoke that billowed from the brick chimneys was thick, jet black, and carried a heavy, sickening stench of burning, rancid animal fat that could be smelled for miles downwind. The toxic soot coated the lungs of the sailors, causing chronic coughing fits, and blackened their skin like coal miners. Working 12-hour shifts with virtually zero sleep, the men handled boiling liquid fat that could scald skin down to the bare bone with a single accidental splash. By the dark of midnight, under the flickering, hellish orange glow of the furnace fires, the exhausted, blood-soaked crew looked less like mariners and more like demons operating the machinery of the underworld. When the oil was finally boiled clear, it was ladled into large copper cooling pans before being funneled into heavy oak casks. These casks were then lowered into the dark, stifling belly of the ship's hold and stowed away. Only when the last drop of oil was cooled and casked could the fires finally be extinguished. The exhausted men then took up lye and scrubbers, desperately trying to wash the stubborn layer of grease and soot from the decks, knowing all too well that the long, agonizing wait for the next whale would begin the moment the wood dried. Compounding the physical torment of the tryworks was the absolute, inescapable legal tyranny that governed life on board. A whaling captain was not merely an employer. Under maritime law, he was a dictator with total authority over his crew. Once the ship cleared coastal waters, there was no regulatory agency, no union representative, and no coast guard to appeal to. The captain's word was absolute law, and any sign of hesitation, exhaustion, or complaint about the rotten food was swiftly labeled as mutiny. The punishments for minor infractions were medieval in their brutality. If a sailor spoke back to an officer or collapsed from heat exhaustion during a grueling shift, he faced public flogging with a cat-o'-nine tails, his bare back torn open in front of the assembled crew. Alternatively, a captain might order a man bound in heavy iron shackles and thrown into the dark, damp lazarette, a tiny crawl space in the stern, for weeks at a time on a starvation diet of bread and water. Mates and harpooners routinely enforced order through physical violence, using wooden belaying pins or fists to beat sailors into submission. Because of this systemic abuse, desertion rates across the American whaling fleet were staggering. It is estimated that a significant portion of all whaling crews deserted their ships before the voyage reached its conclusion. Thousands of desperate men risked drowning, shark attacks, or being captured by bounty hunters by jumping overboard near isolated Pacific islands. They actively chose to take their chances with an unknown wilderness, foreign cultures, or hostile territory rather than spend one more day trapped inside the wooden cage of their ship. When a battered, grease-slicked whale ship finally returned to its home port after 48 or 60 months at sea, the final, crushing injustice awaited the survivors. The heavy oak casks were hoisted onto the cobblestone docks of New Bedford or Nantucket, the total volume of oil was gauged, and the crew's long-awaited lays were calculated against current market rates. But before a single dollar was paid out, the captain brought out his personal ledger. Every rail ticket advanced 4 years prior, every room and board charge accrued before the sails were raised, and every rotted boot, thin blanket, or plug of tobacco purchased from the slop chest was deducted from the sailor's final share. To make matters worse, captains routinely charged interest on these advances, systematically draining the mariners' earnings. After years of risking their lives against marine monsters, surviving devastating ocean gales, rotting from scurvy, and breathing the toxic smoke of the tryworks, Many green hands walked down the gangplank with less than $25 total to show for half a decade of suffering. Some were handed a final bill, coldly informed that their slop chest debts exceeded their lay, and that they actually owed the ship owners money for the very food that had kept them alive. Broken in body, deeply traumatized, and completely penniless in a strange port city, these men frequently found themselves with only one option to avoid starvation. They would walk straight back into a waterfront recruitment office, listen to another slick shipping agent spin lies about a grand fortune waiting in the deep water, and sign their names to a new contract, surrendering another 4 years of their lives to the machine. The age of American whaling eventually collapsed when petroleum was drilled from the earth, rendering whale oil obsolete almost overnight. The industry left behind massive New England fortunes, beautiful coastal architecture, and a grand literary mythos of maritime adventure. But if you peer closely beneath the romantic watercolor washes of history, you find the faded, blood-stained ink lines of the truth, that the foundations of global industrial power were built directly on the backs of forgotten men who lived, labored, and broke inside a literal floating hell.